Welcome to Parker Hill Church. It is great to have you with us today, whether you're watching online or joining us in person at one of our campuses, which we reopened this weekend, and that is exciting. Hey, today we're continuing this teaching series called Undrink the Kool-Aid. And as the title of this series implies, we've been addressing some ideas that lots of people believe, ideas that sound correct, ideas that seem harmless, but ideas that, if we consume them, have the potential of poisoning our souls. And the sad truth is that we live in a place and a time when deception is so commonplace. I mean, so many people just don't take the time to think deeply and carefully about the really important issues of our lives. And so we buy into certain ideas simply because they're popular. And we live our lives by slogans and sound bites, and as a result, we end up embracing ideas that sound correct, but are ultimately false, and sometimes very dangerous. And today, as we continue the series, I want to talk about an idea that has become very, very popular in our culture. It's this idea that truth is relative. In other words, truth is whatever I believe it is. Now, we don't usually hear it stated that way. Nowadays, it sounds more like this: live your truth. I'm sure you've heard that, haven't you? In other words, your truth is your truth, and my truth is my truth, so I'm just going to live my truth, and you can live your truth. Live your truth. Another common phrase is this one: speak your truth. In 2018, Oprah Winfrey was giving a speech at the Golden Globe Awards, and she said this. She said, "What I know for sure is that speaking your truth is the most powerful tool we all have." So we say, live your truth or speak your truth. And then a couple of weeks ago, I came across a book on Amazon. It was actually a book about fashion, and it was entitled Dressing Your Truth. I'm not making that up. Dressing Your Truth. And I actually like that one because now, whenever my wife says to me, honey, that outfit really doesn't go together, I just say, well, hey, I'm dressing my truth. Like, I happen to think plaids and polka dots go really well together. That's my truth. You have your truth. But the underlying message behind all those phrases is that there really is no standard of truth. There are only differences of opinion. And so whatever is right for me is right for me, and whatever is right for you is right for you. You just need to live your truth and speak your truth, and I'll live and speak my truth. That is the spirit of our age. That is the cultural Kool-Aid that we are offered every single day, and we're going to talk about that today. Now, as I was thinking about this and contemplating truth and where we find it and thinking about these ideas of right and wrong, I couldn't help but think about some of the laws that we have as a country. I don't know if you realize this or not, but we have some very interesting laws in different places around the country. Let me tell you about some of them. These are actual laws. For instance, in Chico, California, they have a law that says detonating a nuclear device within the city limit will result in a $500 fine. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm going to detonate a nuclear device, the fine probably is not going to stop me. Then in the state of Alabama, there's this law. It is illegal to impersonate a clergyman. Like, you can actually be fined $5,000 in Alabama for impersonating a clergyman. My only question is, why would you want to? And then in Fairbanks, Alaska, they have this law. It is illegal to give alcoholic beverages to a moose. I would love to know the circumstances that led to that law. And actually, it's a pretty good law because you do not want to have a drunken moose walking around your neighborhood. And then in the little town of Woonsocket, Rhode Island, the city council made it illegal to remove icicles from any building by shooting at them with a gun. Like, do you really need a law for that? I don't know, maybe you do in Rhode Island, because in the state of Rhode Island, there's a state law that says this: any marriage where either of the parties is an idiot or lunatic will be null and void, which might kind of explain the no shooting icicles with the gun law. But we have a lot of laws in this country that just seem so random and so unnecessary and just completely outdated. And you hear those and you think, who came up with those and why? In the same way, I look at the culture in which we live, and I look at some of the values that are promoted. I look at some of the ideas we hear every day about what's right and what's wrong, and I think the same thing. Who came up with those? And why? And then I'll sit down with somebody whose life is just falling apart, and I hear their story and the choices they've made and their values that led to those choices and their ideas about what's right and what's wrong. And I think to myself, how did you arrive at those values and why? So today I want to talk about truth and where we find it and the law under which we live. And we're going to focus our attention on the words of Jesus in the Gospel of John, chapter 8. And the Gospel of John is really one of the 4 biographies in the Bible that tell the story of Jesus. And here in this passage of Scripture, Jesus was speaking to the people of his day. And he says some profound things about truth. Let me read it for you. To those who had believed him, Jesus said, "If you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." They answered him, "We are Abraham's descendants and have never been slaves of anyone. How can you say that we shall be set free?" Jesus replied, "Very truly I tell you, everyone who sins is a slave to sin. Now a slave has no permanent place in the family, but a son belongs to it forever. So if the Son, capital S, if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed." Now let me go back and walk through that with you a little bit more slowly. It begins this way in verse 31. To those who had believed him, Jesus said, "If you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples." In other words, the real test of your faith is not what you say, it's what you do. The real test of authentic faith is not whether you prayed a prayer at some point or made a decision or memorized a creed. Jesus says, if you hold to my teaching, then you are really my disciples. And then he goes on to make this incredible statement. He says, "And as you hold to my teaching," verse 32, "then you will know the truth." You will know the truth. You will know the truth. Now, I want to stop here and talk about this idea of truth, because one of the most important questions you can ever answer in your life is this question: where will I seek truth? In other words, how do I sort out right from wrong in my life? What is my moral and ethical compass? How do I decide where to put the boundaries in my life? Where will I seek truth? And when it comes to answering this question, there are only 3 options. When it comes right down to it, there are only 3 places where we can seek the truth. And I'll tell you all 3. Here's the first option. We can look, number 1, to an internal source of truth. In other words, my source of truth is me, my own opinion, my own feelings. That's my source of truth. Years ago, I read a book by the sociologist Robert Bellah, a book entitled Habits of the Heart. And in writing this book, he interviewed more than 200 Americans about their religious beliefs and their philosophy of life. And one of the people he quotes in his book is a woman by the name of Sheila. Here's what she said. She said, "I believe in God. I'm not a religious fanatic. I can't remember the last time I went to church, but my faith has carried me a long way. It's Sheilaism, my own little voice. If I were to define my own Sheilaism, it's just to try to love yourself and be gentle with yourself." Now, that way of thinking is very common today. Sheila probably represents a good number of Americans who just say, you know what, I have my own internal source of truth. But here's the question. Where does that lead? Like today, there's something like 320 million people in the United States. And so if every person looks for truth within himself or herself, that means we have 320 million different standards of truth. I don't think that leads anywhere good. In fact, in one of the darkest periods of history in the entire Bible, it's described in the book of Judges. The book of the Bible called Judges describes this time of great darkness and great corruption in the nation of Israel. And the book ends with one sentence that explains why the nation of Israel had become so dark and so corrupt. Very end of the book, Judges 25:21, it says, "In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes," and it led to disaster. But that's one option, right? We can look for truth to an internal source. Here's the second option. We can look to an external source of truth. In other words, some people would say, well, individual opinion is not enough. We as a society should determine what's right and wrong. And if we just get enough opinions, enough perspectives, then, we together will eventually find the truth. Kind of like what I would call crowdsourcing the truth. But here's the problem with that kind of thinking. The problem is this: we live in a fallen world, a world in which every human heart is tainted with sin and selfishness. Even if we put all our heads together and try to figure out what's right and what's wrong, that won't be enough. It really won't. In fact, years ago, I came across a story that illustrates the problem with trying to find truth in the society around us. The story goes like this. There was a certain man who, on his way to work every morning, would walk past a clockmaker's shop. It was part of his ritual to stop for a moment, gaze at the big grandfather clock standing in the shop window. And one day, the clockmaker, who had noticed his behavior, stepped outside and struck up a conversation. "This one's a real beauty, isn't she?" he said, pointing to the clock in the window. "I'll say," said the man on the street, "but to tell you the truth, I actually have another motive for stopping here every day. You see, I've got a very important job, and you help me do it. I'm the guy at the factory who blows the whistle when it's time to start work and when it's time to leave. This wristwatch of mine is notoriously unreliable. So every day I stop and recalibrate it with this magnificent clock of yours." "Is that so?" said the clockmaker, smiling. "I hate to tell you this, but the reason this grandfather clock doesn't sell is that it doesn't keep time very well. In fact, I have to set it every single day right at 4 o'clock when I hear the whistle go off at your factory." That's a great picture of our situation. All of us are like broken clocks. Our hearts are tainted with sin and selfishness. We can't just look to one another and find the truth. That doesn't work. And besides, if we say that society determines what's right, then we have to ask which society or which segment of society? The majority? The most powerful people? The people with the most money? And historically, this way of determining truth has some very serious problems. I mean, keep in mind that for a large part of our nation's history, we thought it was okay to enslave other human beings. I mean, that was our truth. You see, we run into some real problems when we say that society should determine truth. We put way too much trust in human nature if we believe that. So here's the third option: an eternal source of truth. We look beyond ourselves, we look beyond the shifting opinions of our culture, and we look to a source of truth that is eternal and unchanging. Those are really the only three options: an internal source of truth, an external source of truth, or an eternal source of truth. Now, since I'm a pastor and this is a sermon, I'm sure you can guess which one of those I believe is the best option. We need an eternal source of truth, which is why Jesus said, "If you hold to my teaching, you will know the truth." And then he goes on to make this incredible promise. He goes on to say this: "And the truth will set you free." The truth will set you free. And again, this is so countercultural because most people today think real freedom means that you have no restrictions. Real freedom means getting rid of all authority, getting rid of all constraints. Real freedom means that you and you alone get to decide what you're going to do with your money, with your body, with your mind, with your sexuality. I mean, no restrictions. But that does not lead to freedom. It doesn't. You see, Christianity agrees with the culture on what freedom feels like. Freedom is, it's feeling alive and fulfilled. It's feeling like you're doing exactly what you were meant to do. But Christianity and Scripture departs from the culture when it comes to how we get that freedom. Because the Bible tells us, and God tells us, that real freedom is only possible within the boundaries of truth. You will know the truth, and it's the truth that will set you free. Here in the United States, we have what we call freeways. But freeways are free only because there are laws that govern their use. In fact, there are more laws on freeways than there are on normal roads. Like you can only drive in one direction. And there are specific ramps where you can get on or get off. And there's not only an upper speed limit, there's a minimum speed limit. And there are laws that keep bicycles and pedestrians off the freeways. See, the reason why freeways are safe to drive on at high speeds is not because of the absence of laws, but because there are so many laws. And I'll tell you, one of the reasons why we have so many people crashing morally, and why families are falling apart, and why so many people are struggling with addictions, is because they have decided to drink the Kool-Aid that says, don't worry about boundaries, don't worry about truth, just go out there and be free. Live your truth. Tim Keller says it really well in his book entitled Every Good Endeavor. He writes this: modern people like to see freedom as the complete absence of any constraints. But think of a fish. Because a fish absorbs oxygen from water, not air, it is free only if it is restricted to water. If a fish is freed from the river and put on the grass to explore, its freedom to move and even to live is soon destroyed. The fish is not more free, but less free. Real freedom is only possible within the boundaries of truth. Let me pick up here, verse 33. They answered him, we are Abraham's descendants, and we have never been slaves of anyone. How can you say that we shall be free? They pretty much missed the point. They were thinking of physical slavery. Jesus, however, was talking about a very different kind of slavery, a far more serious kind of slavery. Verse 34, Jesus replied, I tell you the truth, everyone who sins, and that word is in the present tense, meaning not sins once, but sins as an ongoing pattern. Everyone who sins is a slave to sin. In other words, when we move outside the boundaries of God's authority, we don't find greater freedom. In fact, we find just the opposite. We lose our freedom. We end up enslaved to sin. We end up enslaved to our passions, our habits, our desires. We get enslaved to our guilt and our shame. We become enslaved to the consequences, right? And some of you know this personally. Maybe there was a time in your life when you said, I am a free person. I will choose for myself what I'm going to put into my body. But now you spend every day fighting an addiction to drugs or alcohol. And what started off as a pursuit of freedom has cost you your freedom. Or maybe there was a time when you said, it's my money, I earn it, I control it, nobody's going to tell me what to do with it, especially not an invisible God. This is my life. But then today you find yourself with a boatload of debt on things you don't even enjoy anymore. And the truth is, you haven't gained freedom. You've lost it. Or maybe you say, I'm free to say whatever I want to say. Nobody's going to control my words but me. But in your freedom of expression, you have alienated the people around you and destroyed your relationships. And your pursuit of freedom has actually led you to a prison of loneliness. In your search for freedom, you lost your freedom. And so many people say, listen, I don't want anybody else telling me what to do, especially God, right? But in our attempts to put God behind us and pursue freedom, at the end of the day, we actually end up with less freedom. And by the way, this is true, not only on a personal level, but this is true on a societal level as well. Any society that drifts away from a transcendent standard of truth will end up having less freedom, not more freedom. And I'll tell you who really understood this was the founders of our nation. For example, George Washington, our first president, when he gave his closing address, and I love the story of George Washington, his life. He served for 2 terms. He could have served at that point for a 3rd term, but he chose to walk away from office. And King George of England at that point, he reportedly said that George Washington was the greatest leader who ever lived because he had the power to walk away from that kind of opportunity. But after he finished up his 2nd term, he gave a closing address to our nation. And he included an entire section in that closing address on the importance of religious commitment. I don't have time to read the whole thing, but let me just read the opening sentence of that part of his farewell address. He said, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In other words, he was warning us really that our nation could only flourish when we as a people look outside of ourselves for truth and guidance. Then John Adams, his vice president, became the 2nd president of the United States. He wrote these words. He said, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. In other words, if there is no moral consensus, if there is no collective sense of right and wrong that stands outside of human opinion, he said, then this grand experiment in freedom will fail. The founders of our nation realized that for this republic to work, there had to be a belief in a sovereign God and divine law in the hearts of its people. Because without that, you can't really be free. Do you know why we have so many laws in this country and why we keep adding more? Because our laws have to cover every single eventuality because Americans are always looking for loopholes, right? And in a culture where there is no internal moral compass, you need more and more and more laws to keep our basic instincts in check, which means we all have less freedom. Do you know why so many people have locks and security systems and weapons? Because so many people today don't have an internal sense of right and wrong. And when there is no internal moral compass in a culture, you need more and more force to hold back the anarchy, which means we all have less and less freedom. Jesus said the truth will set you free. The truth will not restrain you. The truth will set you free. And by the way, not my truth, not your truth, the truth. And then Jesus goes on in verse 35 and makes this powerful statement. He says, now a slave has no permanent place in the family, but a son belongs to it forever. This contrast between a slave and a son. And slavery existed in that culture just like it did in the early days of our nation. But a slave has no rights, no security, no future. A slave can be sold at any moment to the highest bidder. But a son, on the other hand, has relationship. There is love, there is security, there is a sense of belonging. And Jesus here is painting this powerful contrast. And he's saying this, sin will do its best to turn you into a slave to your passions, a slave to your habits, a slave to your guilt. But there is a Father in heaven who wants to make you his child. There's a God in heaven who loves you and wants to have a relationship with you, and he wants you to trust him enough to live within the boundaries that he has established. And I love the way that Jesus puts this whole issue of truth and right and wrong and boundaries into the context of relationship. Because in a healthy father-child relationship, the child knows that the father loves him. And the father understands the best way for his child to live this life and flourish. And here's the great thing about Christianity. Here's what makes it different from any religion that's out there. Christianity is not an invitation to embrace a code of conduct or keep a set of rules. Christianity, the gospel, is an invitation into relationship. And listen, as that relationship deepens, trust deepens. And as trust deepens, we find it easier and easier to live under God's authority. And listen, many of you are Christians, but if you're honest, you would say that you find it kind of difficult to live within the boundaries of Scripture, that truth. Here's why. It's probably because your relationship is not where it should be. There's no prayer except when you're in trouble. You're not drinking deeply from his word. You're not in a position daily where you're saying, God, I want to know you. I want to sense your presence in my life in a real way. Because when that begins to happen, as that relationship deepens, then trust deepens. And you begin to open God's word. And he says, here's how I want you to live. Here's what I want you to do with your kids and your marriage. And here's how I want you to handle your personal life and your finances and your sexuality. And you say, well, God, I don't understand that. I don't understand why. And I don't know anybody else who lives this way. But because I trust you, but because I love you, because you're my Father, I will say yes. So here's the bottom line. Here's the bottom line. Truth is not relative. If you want to know how to live a life of joy and peace and freedom, it's about surrendering to your Father in heaven who loves you and wants only what's best. It's not about living my truth or speaking my truth. It's about living within the boundaries of his truth.